Okay, so let's start. So, the three of us are here. Here is a German World War II bunker underneath the gardens at the back of the Arsenale in Venice. Let's start out just by introducing ourselves very briefly, names and what we do. So I'll go first. Sam Thorne. I'm a writer and a curator, and I'm the director of Nottingham Contemporary in the UK.
Helga Christoffersen. I'm a curator, recently director of a new institution in Copenhagen, Art Hub Copenhagen.
Michael Birchall. I'm an academic and a curator. I work at Tate Liverpool, where I'm curator of public practice, and I work at Liverpool School of Art, where I'm an academic.
So, we were talking before about how best to start, and there are several ways into this. I think one would be for us to reflect slightly on the context of where we are and how that might overlap with education. Or we could talk a little kind of briefly for 5 minutes or so about the role of education in our work. Whichever you think.
I think that would be nice to start off. I think also we might even define, when we say education, we might even think about that differently, or
I think we will.
Let's
or define it differently, which I think could be a nice starting point.
So let's start there, and I would encourage us to talk about it not only in terms of like professional experience, but also probably like personal histories with education as well. You know? Do you want to go first, Helga?
Sure. Maybe to start off, with the personal a little bit. I think my way into so this field was, let's say, very much like an educational pursuit, coming from a context and a city, Copenhagen, that felt, at least in terms of art world education, or way into an educational system, which is really about like a knowledge in a contemporary field, felt very remote. Meaning sort of my way into the art world was also really through pursuing education elsewhere, and just like the structure, like structurally doing that, of course financially doing that, geographically, etc. So that brought me to many different places. First Berlin, then New York, which then sort of also ended up defining my own path and my work. But that was really like an educational pursuit to start with, or at least a desire to be part of a certain conversation that wasn't present where I was, and that I didn't really even know what really was.
Sure.
But surely a sense that that an educational context was a way to pursue a sort of even to figure out how I fit it in. Or
so your personal experience of formal education is completely bound up with leaving Denmark, right, and going to other cities and another continent.
Yeah, for sure. Then of course later on, then stepping into sort of a professional work life, then comes education in the sense of being the author of thoughts, or of shows, or of works, or of like a spatial context in which then like outreach and a thought system around who comes in and who is interested and who comes to you, or who looks for what you do is sort of, so that's sort of turned around in the sense of producing something, or and thinking about who to bring into that.
And what did you study when you were in Berlin?
Berlin, art history and philosophy, cultural studies, cultural science, and in New York specifically, curatorial studies. That was sort of also a way out of art history.
Michael, maybe if you talk a little bit about your own history of education before we move on to how it functions for us.
I loved education. I must say, even from a young age, I was really a big fan of going to school, and I think learning and being interested in learning new things is something that I've always kept up in my. So even now, I'm learning a language, as an example, like on the side, as a kind of extra curricular activity. But I think my formal education in university was really important to give me a sort of broad breadth of knowledge. But I would say that it wasn't until when I started working in what I do now with the museums and galleries is that that only provided sort of a basic entry level. I think I learnt a lot on the job, like most people do. And then when I did a PhD just a few years ago, that really felt like a kind of selfish moment in my career and in my life, because it allowed me to spend 3.5 years researching a topic that I was interested in, looking at different models, and not being restrained really in any other way. So I always encourage people now to do PhDs for very selfish reasons, because I think that's what you should do really, and having that formal environment to do that can be really, really good in your career or in your life. But when you were talking, and I just jotted down lifelong learning, which is this sort of new Labour British notion of how we learn continually in the course of our lives. And I just wondered if you'd had any position on that in terms of how your own learning experience has continued out of the formal education model.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I guess when you say learning on the job, I feel that there's, at least in the curatorial field, that there's a lot. You step out of an educational context, and then you actually really start learning something, which is just about so much more systemic and structural. I really feel than focusing on any sort of pure knowledge-driven inquiry or subject matter. Like I feel a lot of what I do or have done is at least is just to kind of navigate an idea or an ambition within a set of circumstances. That's really like, that's sort of the task at hand, or what has to be at least learned. What I spent like many years learning, and then at some point I also sort of strive to get back into a more academic environment. Applied for a PhD, which is then a practice-based PhD in the sense of applying, not just thinking about, let's say, a theoretical endeavor, but also to take a experience or knowledge, let's say, from the field, and start to think about that in an academic setting, which is then sort of also a challenge of bridging those two, which has felt incredibly privileged and lucky to be able to do. And then sort of when you say lifelong learning, I think, for me, that moment where I also started to feel that I could learn more, that's somehow when I also start to think about a shift, or at least kind of take an initiative to take a new step, just in order to be able to continue that. And I guess I recently stepped into a situation where I'm really learning on the job.
What about your story, Sam?
So, just listening to you both talk, I realise I've reflected very little on my own experiences of education. But for me, so my mother was, until she retired a year or two ago, a high school teacher. She taught geography for many years. And my father was, until he retired a couple of years ago, was a scientist of sorts. He was working in telecommunications, but he did a PhD on, just before I was born, and he was an astrophysicist, and he was working in the field of astronomy. And his PhD was on the dark side of the moon. And he started his research literally the year that the Pink Floyd album of the same name came out. And the epigraph for his dissertation, which I've read and is extremely boring, is taken from a song from that album. And so my dad was part of this, I guess, generation of like British prog rock influenced scientists who were kind of taking, that kind of run of like cosmic albums in, you know, like prog and krautrock and ambient from the mid 70s, and actually forging a career, a research career out of it. So I suppose when I think of my own education, it's partly I was definitely aware of school and schooling from an early age, because my mother was then quite young, was quite good friends with lots of the sixth form students, like 17, 18-year-olds. So they would kind of come over to our house for like lunch or whatever. And at the same time, my dad's like research colleagues would also kind of be around. So I suppose a few things there is like having an awareness of proximity to schools, to research centers, but sitting outside of it. And then also I think through my dad's work, having this idea that a field like popular music could intersect with thinking about space, you know. And I remember, when you were saying, Michael, that you enjoyed school, I remember being extremely scared on my first day of school, because what little I knew about school at that point was through my mum teaching 17 and 18-year-olds like geography, right? And so all I knew was that it involved textbooks. I had no idea what textbooks were, but I guess I'd seen them before, and they looked really off-putting. And I remember just thinking, you know, being like 4 or 5 and just thinking like, shit, I've got to go and read textbooks. And I got to my first day of primary school, and it was just like, obviously, kids pouring water and sand through funnels. And I just remember thinking, this is school? Like this I can do. And yeah, so, and then we moved around a lot when I was a kid because of my dad's work. And so for me, education was from an early age very connected with moving context, moving from countryside to cities and back again, and making new friends and losing touch with people. So that's kind of, yeah, I mean, that's my schooling. And I guess I did enjoy it. And then at university, I studied literature, and I did a BA. I didn't do an MA or a PhD. And that was at Cambridge, which is an extremely conservative institution. It's one of the oldest literature programs in the world, and literature is still largely taught there as it would have been taught in the 1840s or 50s when the program was first emerged. That is to say, you're literally taught the kind of history of English literature chronologically. So starting from about the 8th century with some of the kind of early Middle English poetry, marching through medieval kind of Renaissance, all the way to the kind of post-colonial, which they were very ill-equipped to deal with. And after about a year, I became aware of a kind of art history, I suppose, which I hadn't previously been particularly aware of as a field, and tried to switch, and then realized quickly that the way that art history was taught at Cambridge kind of finished in about 1910, really. And I already knew that I was primarily interested in like post-war and contemporary. So I was advised just to stay with that, with my program, and to work on papers and essays that kind of worked a little away or kind of on the margins of what you would think of as literature in that kind of forum. So I was able to, you know, kind of work on like Frankfurt School and kind of through to, I suppose, the kind of October-ish bunch of critics and theorists. And so I suppose for me, like my experience of education was always tending away from what it was that I was purportedly there to do. You know, felt like I could somehow reroute the course for my own purposes, which were like largely, although I didn't yet know it, starting to think about curating, certainly starting to think about art history.
But when you say that's kind of an old-fashioned notion of an arts education, that one is exposed to literature, visual art, film, design, that you know, at the core, that is the nature of those degrees, that one is exposed to the topics and then writes a dissertation on that or takes that in a different direction. I mean, I certainly felt that my education was like that. You could really, you know, you even though you were doing art history, you sort of had to be quite well read. You had to know your classic texts, and if you didn't, you were kind of a bit of
the peculiarity
sort of left behind.
The peculiarity at Cambridge is really to do with this system that emerged there called practical criticism, right? And the idea, which I suppose started to emerge in the 20s, being that all you needed was the text. You didn't need the date, you didn't need the author, You did not need any historical context whatsoever. Everything that you needed to glean from a poem was there. And through a series of close readings, you could get to the kind of truth of the text. That remains 100 years later how literature is largely taught at undergrad level there. And so any of the challenges that structuralist thinking, post-structuralist thinking kind of posed to that mode of reading was dismissed, really.
Yeah.
You know, like famously, Derrida was offered an honorary doctorate from Cambridge, and there was uproar among a number of professors there, and it was turned down because like that. I remember Derrida like died in 2004. It was when I was studying, and I remember kind of reading about him, being barely aware of who he was because, you know, like continental philosophy, critical theory was not really kind of there, even like among kind of younger academics. So I think for me, when I then finished that, moving into, I then became a critic. The art world, broadly defined, felt tremendously exciting precisely because it was so promiscuous in its thinking and so absorptive of other fields, you know, that like here was a place where you could read this stuff and kind of anything else, you know.
But it's nice to think about like that place of actually starting in some kind of general point of departure or within another discipline. I started in history as well. And and found myself like doing the first year like full on, like spent 1 year studying the history of Nazism. I was sitting in a bunker and ended up spending a full year actually studying like the cultural policies of the Third Reich. And
is that something you chose to do, or that was like a fixed module?
I just gravitated towards that to understand like what was like the relationships to aesthetics and how did that develop. And you can really break that down to like which day was this said, what this then happened, what about that Nolde painting, right? You can really go into it. But that was sort of a very weird way into, which is just me trying to make something exciting out of what I was given.
Sure. Yeah. And then you did curatorial studies.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is a really like young field, right? Of like they
Is
only
it
emerged.
young though nowadays? Isn't it like
It's only the Bard was one of the first, right?
Yeah,
and that was like late 80s, early 90s.
I would say it's quite an established discipline now, even though it's it's young within like, you know, other areas.
Compared to art history, it's extremely young.
But it's very much established as a sort of, you know, there's a certain set of prescribed texts. There's a certain
Did it feel that way when you were there?
historiography to it.
I have to say no, like that did feel very exploratory in the sense of like the question there was asked, what is this even? You know, that was that the. I think it's also just because it's depending on which program you're in, like the teaching capacity like really defines that for you, and that can be very different personalities with very different experiences, and it's sort of, at least my experience was that it was such an open field of study that does really like I didn't come in and then it's like bam, this is the textbook of it, read it through and then you get it. Right? No, that's very much not the. Well, that was certainly my experience of art history, right?
I mean, I teach it now basically, and I've taught it for a number of years, and I think what keeps me still interested in it as a sort of field is that the interdisciplinary aspect, that you can really explore a multitude of concepts, ideas, texts, but it sort of requires the kind of teaching staff to have that broad knowledge, or if they don't, then you have to pass them on to a person who might. But I think when I meant the kind of historiography of curatorial studies is the kind of sort of texts that explore the field of the, you know,
totally, like you mean in like the history of exhibitions, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
You sit down and you go through that canon.
Yeah,
of course.
I think that's quite interesting as well, and how that sort of intersects with art history, in some cases.
Yeah, I guess I was literally last year I ended up then teaching there, and I felt maybe that was what I brought to that was a course on a collection show. I made a collection show with the students and
Mm-hmm.
kind of really steward them through that.
Mm-hmm.
But that was very different than the historical exercise of that. That was the
Mhm.
very real, like structural, what you need to think about exercise in the sense of getting beyond the text,
Mm-hmm.
getting into something where
Yeah.
you were actually dealing with the material in your hands.
Michael, did you study curating?
I did. It was kind of art gallery museum studies trying to be curating. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And that basically untangled all the things that I learned from my very conservative first degree. But so it was quite useful. It was very practical, and
As in practical in the sense that it was trying to train museum curators?
it was a bit like there was some training elements in it, but it was also very much, it was taught by people who had worked as curators, so they weren't kind of trying to sugarcoat this art industry,
Mhm.
and I think, and that certainly informed my own teaching now, because I hold this funny job where I'm in both worlds, and I'm very much a realist that this is not actually a great industry to work in, and not everybody's going to will become a curator. And I think one of the things that I was trying debate and discuss is that within the art system there's like a multitude of options available that might extend into the curatorial or the educational, but they're all ultimately about delivering education to audiences maybe, or sharing different kinds of practices. And I
Mhm.
think you can do that in many different ways now within a kind of museum system.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I didn't study curating, but I wanted to, and I had this very convoluted idea about how I would go about, I don't know, doing that, which I won't go into. But I after I graduated, I quite soon after got a job working at Frieze magazine. I was initially writing more about music, and then kind of gradually writing about art. And throughout that time, I suppose in my early 20s, I was thinking, I'd want to go back to school to do some version of a curating MA. And I just kind of then didn't. After some time, I realized that essentially like just what was being provided for me by then, this like very close-knit, very kind of good bunch of friends who were all of the editors, that was enough. Like that's what I was looking for. And like among them at the time, one was finishing a much delayed PhD about like conceptual art and pop music. Someone was just writing her first novel. One was running a record label and playing in bands. And so while none of them were actually, one, Jörg Heiser was curating shows, the others weren't. But kind of among them, that was a version of like the curatorial as a field, right? It was just happened to be people who were also putting out a magazine 8 times a year. And at this time, it was very deprofessionalized. There was kind of very little scrutiny about what the magazine could be. It was also at a moment, I suppose, in the late 2000s when like the publishing industry was collapsing, and so just throwing into question what a magazine was actually. Could it be an event series? Could it be music? Could it be video? Whatever. And that felt like tremendously exciting. And I think in retrospect, I was somehow able to kind of frame that as a kind of an educational experience, because we would just sit down and have long lunches every day, and I would ask them lots of questions. Like that was, and it was my first time living in London, and so I think for me, like that was a kind of an alternative to an MA, and it kind of felt not that it was structured in any kind of sense, but we were sharing books and sharing, all of those kinds of things.
I was just going to say, that's a really nice way that you talk about this magazine being this place where all these open possibilities can happen, and that you were able to navigate around this discourse with your peers, and I guess they became mentors, really.
Mm-hmm. I think so, absolutely. I think, and now when occasionally I teach on writing programs like the one at the Royal College, when we talk about magazines, there's just like that kind of definition of what a magazine is in the kind of military sense of it being a place to hold explosive material. And I certainly don't think there are many magazines that do that now, particularly in the kind of like contemporary art magazines, but I still like hold on to that kind of dream of like what magazines can be and the way in which they can bring together a range of different voices. So yeah, that was kind of important for me, and it was what if I hadn't been doing that, for sure I would have been doing an MA. So I tend to think of them as somehow related. Yeah.
That makes me really think about like the importance of institutions or structures that they can they can often stand in place of actual educational, an educational experience, that it's much.
Because my sense of not having studied curating, kind of what I always kind of saw quite enviously of like colleagues at that time as kind of having gained, was partly that kind of grounding that you're describing of like a history of exhibitions or a history of the changing role of the curator, let's say. But it also furnishes you with a network, right, of both mentors and peers. And I remember being kind of in my mid-20s and just like, how does everyone know everyone? And then it taking a while to realize that actually this is kind of one of the things that the MA programs at art schools, anywhere, that's kind of what it does, right?
I also did something a bit weird in that I did this program in Canada at the Banff Centre, which was a sort of, it was called a curatorial work study, which is quite common in the States, but it's basically a training program. So I worked for the gallery as an assistant curator 4 days a week, and on the 5th day was my research day. But I had all these amazing mentors that were people that worked there. So back then it was Kitty Scott was the director, but then Banff is this amazing place in the mountains where every 6 to 8 weeks there'd be this turnover of artists, curators, critics, writers that would like come into town, and then so it was kind of like I have to say it's still a network that I still live off, in the sense that I still get things from that time, and that was a long time ago now, but it was really life changing, and that kind of opportunity to sort of train in a way in institutions such as that is really, really rare.
So you both like had experiences in quite rural or like remote places.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
But I mean, but there's really something to say about a group of people coming together with an intention. Like, rather, that was a big change for me, rather than to sit in those art history programs where I don't even know, like people don't really kind of flag their intention or their ambition or their passion. Maybe because it's a place where you didn't really discover that yet, but for sure coming to a place where like even, remotely, but everybody was there with a mission. And I think that's that kind of then even if you don't know, right, maybe as you landing at Frieze or in that group of people, like even all of those things you didn't know, like you also came with a very clear just intention or desire.
But that idea of a kind of a shared intention, is that quite rare? Or I'm just thinking, like, if you compare it to like going to med school or wherever lawyers study, lawyer academy, where actually it's a kind of series of like very regulated examinations that you're going to do, whereas like obviously curatorial studies is utterly different, but it's vocational in a certain sense, right? Yeah,
but I guess thinking about like medicine, right? Like I guess there's sort of a formula you step into, I know I have friends who complete, and the thing about that is like you're there to complete it, and once you've completed it, then you can go to the next step, and eventually, right? That there's more sort of a.
There's a track that you literally have to do.
And something is more fun than other things, but the thing is, it's a package. Like you go for that. I said like my experience is something that I realized very quickly is that it was about what was driving me. Like it was about my set of interests. Like you were sitting around a table and people are asking you, what are you interested in? And if you don't have an answer, then you are sort of
out in the cold.
Whether but you also I also figured out like that was a really positive like energy, that was a driving force for something, right? As soon as you had that, like you sort of had it's not about power, but then you you had something with like fire in it or something
Mm.
like that you could.
I think
you could take somewhere.
sure. I think I missed that because working at a magazine, you're a generalist almost by definition, right? You're kind of interested in. You have to be interested in the stuff that's happening in a very broad way, right? There's like you're covering these exhibitions because these exhibitions are happening at these institutions or these biennials or whatever. You kind of, and probably what started to frustrate me after some years was you have a very, very broad remit, but one that's also maybe relatively shallow in terms of the amount it kind of penetrates given subjects or areas. Whereas I think I was never forced to articulate clearly, certainly at that point, what my research focus was or kind of interests were.
I think that's what formal education does really well, and it kind of positions learners to position their research or their interests, and it's a useful exercise to be precise, but also coming from a university perspective, it's also a place where you're able to you're given freedom, but you're also given the intellectual space to explore a topic that interests you, that doesn't it doesn't have to be linked to any threads actually. It can just exist on its own.
Can we turn a little to, Helga, you're still doing a PhD, so in a sense you are still kind of undergoing, if we can use that word, process of like formal education, but kind of when...
But wait, that doesn't mean that you and I are done.
Sorry?
Like this, but obviously you and I aren't like done with our education, surely.
Well, what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I might want to learn something else in the future. You might want to go and do, I don't know. It's like it isn't. I don't think it stops at a certain point.
But if we're talking about definitions, wouldn't one like working definition here be the difference between education? You can't help but learn, right? Like we all learned today that there's a bunker here, and like we kind of had to, and we were led down here, and now we know about it. Like you can't really resist learning in that sense. I can resist education.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go and do an MA or PhD now. And I'm pretty sure about that. But I don't know. What do you think is?
Well,
I think for me, like education has to do with some form of structure or some kind of form of institution.
Maybe that's a topic that we can discuss later on then. Because I think we mentioned that over lunch, but maybe we can come back to that. That kind of, even we were talking about institutions and the trend that we call the learning department versus education department. Maybe we can unpack that as well.
Yeah, I'd like to get to that. Like, what is an education without institutions? I'm not really sure. Something I am interested in, but I do think that learning. My personal kind of definition. I don't really think I've had to articulate this before. But one definitional distinction between learning and education is that learning is lifelong, almost by definition, and continuous, and daily, and informal. And those are all things that education can be, but isn't necessarily, I would say.
I think there's also a separate discussion on what an educational system gives you in terms of a certain validation, and what that has meant at different moments in time, or maybe what it means today.
Yeah, sure.
Right? I guess I'm sort of thinking about that as well, being in a PhD program. On the one hand, that gave me the opportunity to think in a like very practically. Actually, it gave me some space, some resources, a way of thinking that was like not otherwise possible where I was.
Sure.
But of course, part of that is also that it gives. Once I hopefully, fingers crossed, finish that, I sort of have, I have that. That's also a system of validation that I can use, or that fits within a larger structure, right? Which is a question of within the educational system, the PhD, and what that means. Both for like we sit here sort of as the thinking academic side of that. The project that I ended up doing as sort of my graduating project when at CCS, which
Mm.
is the standard there is that you do your first exhibition, and like that's the big thing, and you produce work with young artists, and it's like the exhibition, and
Mhm.
it's also sort of it has an attention around itself in New York, who's coming out, what do they do, etc.
Right.
So I completely like subverted that, and I didn't do a show. I just done like organized the Danish pavilion here at the Venice Biennial in 2011. Anyway, I'd just done a big show, so that was so I went into this kind of inquiry project around the artist PhD, and to think about art education, and did a comparative kind of study between a kind of a trajectory in Europe and in the US, where that was going in terms of how a PhD for artists, like at that point, and of course also still, like, is sort of becoming a thing, both in a sense of talking about it and what it is, and a point where everybody is also, we're wording practices as research-based practices,
Sure.
right? That's
And
something that entered the language, at least in a curatorial language or something.
Yeah.
To talk about artists, they're only doing research as opposed to works.
And could I ask just like
Mhm.
really briefly, what is that kind of history of artists with PhDs? Like, when did it start, and where? And
Oh, I wish
You
I
know?
had. I wish I had like the year and the
because
and-
it's
and
like
the-
it's not a long. There's not a long history here, right?
It's no, it's certainly not. It's certainly not a long history. I think maybe one answer is that it has, and again now I'm also very like narrow-mindedly. I'm actually just addressing like a European versus like US
Mhm.
context,
Mhm.
or that those systems. In the US, it dates quite a few decades decades back. I wouldn't be able to tell you
Sure.
when, but of course artists also entered like art history programs, right?
Mhm.
And actually did as a part of system of, again, validation in terms of teaching, tenure track,
Mhm.
like the requirements for that.
Mhm.
And and on a European level, I think that there's that development comes a little bit after, in the sense
Mhm.
of European art academies. Generally like the BA, MA,
Mhm.
that system. Of course, the tradition of European academies is so much more, free.
Mhm.
The German Meisterschule, and
Mm.
you
Mhm.
enter. What is your curriculum? Nothing.
Yeah, sure.
You just.
You're just here. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's certainly something that I think really is also has some relationship, of course, to like European regulation
Mhm.
and education.
Mhm. Yeah, sure.
And how that for the last at least 2 decades, there's
Mhm.
really been sort of a restructuring and a push
Mhm.
within that, which is also now like, seeing, especially in academic setting, seeing art academies really, founding PhD programs like
But
right and left.
But can I just ask, do you not think there's still a sort of apprehension or tension around the artist PhD as being like, it's still, I feel like it's still having an identity crisis, like it still struggles with itself, and that when an artist does a practice-based PhD or practice-led PhD, they sort of have to justify their existence in the academy, which is based on this more conventional art historical notions of scholarship. Not only just that, but other forms as well. There's always like still a bit of tension there. It's always like.
But I think it's still very structural, in the sense that in many countries, in most European countries actually, like the in order to actually obtain your degree officially, which is also the case in Denmark, and I know many other countries too, like, yet you might be an artist and it might be recognized that there's a sort of a part of the project that's practice based, but how you then like I guess structurally legally obtain the degree is still by your project running through the academic conventions for that. In Denmark there's real strict legislation on what it means.
Mm-hmm.
To get a PhD, you have to do X, Y, Z.
Mm-hmm.
And so any artist in there doing a PhD, which is still only very few, like, yeah, there's an openness towards what that means. The universities there by now are kind of open to that,
Yeah.
but that doesn't change the fact that there's a like a very set in stone regulation for what you need to fulfill in order to
Mhm.
gain your degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, so that is even at this point shifting, but I think only a very few educational institutions are sort of degree giving beyond the traditional kind of academic, like very close to art history, theoretically based.
Yeah.
What's your
PhD
experience
study.
of that, Michael? Or like from being
It's,
kind of somewhat positioned within the academy?
I think it's. I agree with most of what you're saying, and in terms of the regulations and the requirements of the PhD, yes, it's very structured, but it's still based around the written component that seems to carry much more prominence in the eyes of the university, and the practice is almost referenced within that document as this is what I've been doing, and I'm going to justify it through this methodology I've developed in this PhD. And I almost feel that you need to have an opportunity to see that practice element, however that may be articulated, and that it shouldn't only be through a written output, to use a horrible term like output. But I have a few friends that did practice-based PhDs, and all of them found it really helpful for their own practice, but they also struggled with the limitations of it as a sort of mini PhD in terms of the written component. And I am yet to supervise one. I've just taken on a new student that wanted to do a PhD, and I convinced them to do a normal route PhD and not do practice-based. So maybe it's my own bias, I don't know. But I'm curious.
I'm not sure if this is related, but just something that I've noticed before is like if you look back at major exhibitions in the 50s and 60s, virtually no artist had MAs. In fact, like a lot of artists hadn't gone to art school. But I think of like the kind of big New York 50s and 60s artists, a lot of them did art history programs, right? And then kind of were making work on the side. What's striking now is that in any given, like, we're at Venice, like take a given Venice Biennale, like most artists on that list will have an MA. Probably very few of them in this one anyway would have a PhD, but an MA is the kind of like has become
Like
just
a
the
gold
kind
standard
of
or sorts.
just the terminal kind of degree of it. And when Helga, you were talking earlier about like how do these things validate us or practitioners, it made me think back to that 2013 Biennale that we were talking about earlier, and just I remember really, I think it was like very deftly kind of navigated the kind of biographies of the practitioners in that show. But obviously part of the provocation was that it was this combining of the self-taught with the kind of highly credentialed. And it was extremely glaring, even in sensitively written texts, the way in which the personal lives and narratives and educational histories of these makers was drawn out. That on the one side of the aisle you had those with MAs, and the other side was those with experiences of psychiatric institutions, incarceration. I mean, they were on both sides. They were institutionally defined. But what was striking for me was like the one side like had MAs. You know what I mean? Almost like more so. It made that more glaring for me. It brought it into sharp relief, I suppose, by having self-taught makers showing alongside a kind of professionalized art world. I don't really have a kind of point to make on that, but I suppose it was just for me, it was a kind of moment where I started to notice, oh right, yeah, like the MA is the kind of
But just to
is
add,
the standard
just
now.
to add to it, though, it is a kind of it's a very recent history, and even when we float around the term art world, we can all disagree dates when one might say that began, but certainly
We can say when the term began.
Yeah, we can say when the term began. But the ways in which the artists have positioned themselves in a sort of competitive game of being professional, being taken seriously, having certain exhibition histories and being part of a system,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of postgraduate art education is sort of implicit in that model of this global roving artist that needs to have this kind of validation from a good art school in order to be useful as an artist almost.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think there was a text I read many years ago, and I remember the title was "The MFA is the New MBA," and it was
Mhm.
published by Harvard Business Review.
I've read that
I'm
piece.
sure
Yeah.
you've read it as
Yeah.
well. And that kind of shift as well towards professional practice, but
Mhm.
also through a sort of neoliberal business model,
Mm-hmm.
is also quite relatively recent.
Mhm. And which that idea of lifelong learning is also
Yeah.
of a piece with, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, that it creates the kind of flexible, adaptable workers of
Workforce.
tomorrow. Yeah, yeah. What I was going to ask you is how you. This is I'm keeping this deliberately extremely broad, so go wherever you want with it.
Thank you very much.
But how does education? What is education for you on a day-to-day basis as a curator academic? Like, how does it enter into your life, your kind of professional life, or otherwise?
I can start. I think on my end, recently somehow relocating from New York and working at the New Museum and being part of a big institution there and a curatorial team, education there felt more sort of like a remote kind of aspect of exhibition making, in the sense that at least in that context there was a largely like a separation between curatorial work and the shows we did, and once it's open or once the material is ready, the educators, they can so to say interpret it and take over,
Mhm.
and there's that
Mm-hmm.
there's a sort of a little bit of a disconnect.
And I think that disconnect is entirely typical of museums in the West.
Yeah.
I mean, my own observation is partly it's a question of education of the people in those departments too.
Yeah.
They're like, just in the places I've worked at, and I wonder if this is the same at New Museum, the curatorial department is typically international, has been educated internationally to an MA level or PhD. And the educational learning teams are typically more local in terms of where they've grown up. This is certainly the truth of where I work now. They're from Nottingham. And they went to art school or teacher training college, and will not have studied curating.
Mm. No, I guess it's specifically to speak to the New Museum. However, though, like the educational department there is actually very, as a history of like also a separate or an own sort of curatorial profile. Unji Ju was the curator of
Sure,
education
yeah.
for many years.
Sure, yeah.
Johanna Burton and took over, and like those
Yeah.
were really strong profiles that did
Yeah.
amazing.
Anne Barlow, was she education or was she?
Yeah, but
She was.
many years ago.
Sorry,
Yeah.
even before that.
Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, but anyway, there's sort of an own curatorial
That's true.
profile there, which
Yeah.
is really strong and incredible. So I
Mhm.
think that to the story
That's the difference
there
there.
also belongs
Yeah.
that exists alongside
Mm.
the exhibition program. So it's not necessarily a miss or a
I think that term that you use, like that it has its own curatorial profile, is really interesting because we're sort of assuming a hierarchy that like the exhibition program is more superior to the education program, in that we're articulating as having its own profile, which is in a way independent of that model.
Yeah.
no, for sure. Which
And I'd love to talk about that for hours, actually.
no, but I
We've
totally
got
get
time.
what you're saying. But I guess I don't. When I look at broadly at institutions, I guess it's not. I wouldn't say that about every institution.
Yes, of
Mhm.
course,
Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And the histories get written in different ways, right? The education team, of course, they produce publications, but it's certainly not for every program or every event in a way that
No.
one would expect exhibitions to leave some kind of
Mm.
record. So I'm often struck by how little we know about an education program at a given moment, because it is either temporary or what surrounds it is much more ephemeral materials. You know, I see this myself in my own institution. It's like the exhibition history is very easy to track, you know, but other parts of it much less so.
Yeah, I don't know how many institutions keep files on their education programs. Probably they don't, do they? There is that archive in Leeds in the UK. It's the National Education
Art Education Archives.
There you go.
We have loans from there in our current exhibition. It's a very strange place. It's in a really forgotten former university campus in Yorkshire Sculpture Park. I literally stumbled on it about 3 years ago. The first time I went to Yorkshire Sculpture Park, I saw a sign saying National Arts Education Archive. I was like, what's that? And it's completely volunteer run. They've got the papers of a number of significant artist educators. Richard Hamilton, Victor Passmore, some of the kind of main figures there. But it's, you know, it's an intriguing resource and one that's been kind of underexplored. But yeah, it's focused on artists. It's not focused on museums.
But what I was trying to, in a way, kind of the comparison I was making before was bringing up like New York and the work there in an institution, and then where I am now, which is sort of back in Copenhagen, building up a new institution where education is suddenly like a whole different thing. For me, in the sense that that every day actually feels like part of what the core mission of that is to sort of educate a group of people around me. I'm not saying that in a kind of a superior sense, but also just to think about like an institutional structure as an educational kind of machine of sorts. Just because, like, even going back to where we started, and it's in the sense of like people coming together at a moment in time with an intention, and actually that becoming a learning environment. So that would be very much like a model that I'm actually trying to create.
And you're starting from zero,
but
right?
just out of the sheer really clear sense that that's really needed in that context.
Yeah, I mean, partly I think what we are all grappling with is the built legacy of earlier forms of thinking and of structuring. Like when I think of our own building in Nottingham, you have the top lit galleries up at the top, street facing and so on. Like that's the kind of public view of what the institution does. Hidden underground is a series of education spaces, like with no natural light, with no kind of public access, with so on, they enter through the offices and so on. And so kind of this is a building that was designed in the early 2000s. And to me, it feels like a relic of a very, very different kind of form of institution building.
Yeah, because I mean, we have the same at Tate Liverpool. We were designed in '88.
Yeah.
And we have the most gorgeous education space called the Claus Studio, which has views of the river, and you can get to it from one of the galleries, but you have to go through 2 doors with a swipe. And obviously that is a relic of the late 80s. So it's kind of astonishing that you still have that space. I
so
mean,
it enforces that kind of division that you were describing at the new museum somehow, I think, where you have the kind of exhibitions are still somehow primary and then everything else feels peripheral because the building makes it so.
It's architectural.
Yeah, I guess that also brings us to, I guess, something else than that. I think we had a conversation not too long ago, which was also about a kind of a shift in even to think about like exhibition space. What are they? Where are they? How are those square meters used? How, in terms of how institutions are developing, let's say also new institutions, right? Like what's the sort of division there, like spatially? Like and I guess I'm also asking myself this at a moment in time where potentially very soon taking over a space, having to make that division, etc.
Yeah, sure.
And thinking, is it today like the thing to do and say like you carve out 80% of the best square meters and you make it into the big the big exhibition space, and really that's your mission, or how do you reflect your mission in it, like in the terms of space and how you divide space.
Yeah. And what's your thinking at the moment about how that might manifest?
For sure. Like there's I guess the scenario I'm sort of working with is one where exhibitions fit in as one of 4 or 5 priorities with equal weight. So that does mean a much smaller exhibition space. Then that brings you then to to the sense of, okay, but what can you then sort of exhibitions? They are also still, for institutions, they're an engine for many things, right? They're an engine for production and for also for collaboration. And there's also no point in kind of somehow weakening your engine. It's a tricky priority, because I feel as much as we are really thinking about other modes of working, like not necessarily prioritizing like the material output of artistic practice, but really looking just as a range of different practices and outcomes. I still feel that's like a very prevalent one. We're sitting here, like the Venice Biennial, right? That's a very strong, that it's still, so incredibly, I don't know, powerful. We were just walking, I was walking through there yesterday and thinking, like, my God, the amount of people in November here, that kind of manifestation, it has a lot of weight, right?
Sure.
Both in terms of like our, like us and a kind of a collegial network, or a kind of a critical discussion.
Sure.
It's still
that exhibitions are bound up with forms of power and visibility in a way that I think I would say that it would be rare for education programs to have that kind of weight, let's say.
It's also about how you justify yourself, right? As an institution towards various people, stakeholders, funders, all of the tricky things you navigate.
Yeah.
But I think it's right what you said. It's about how you give things equal weighting, and it's also really depends on artists that you choose to work with, or collectives, or whatever, that the invitation is there, and also expectations about how that's delivered, and also that that both teams don't feel that they can't ask artists to I don't know, do a workshop on building a castle, or I think, and also I was thinking then that there's a sort of within education teams in museums, that there's an intrinsic notion of a duty of care for audiences, constituents, groups that those teams work with, and that they sort of nurture certain relationships over a period of time, and it might not always be the right place to expose those practices inside a highly visible white cube. It might be safer to do this in a space which is not perhaps as accessible as you might like.
Yeah. Before, when I moved to Tate, which is like 6 years ago or something, prior to that I'd never worked in a museum before. I'd never really worked in an institution before. And so these dynamics that we're discussing of these interactions between exhibitions and education teams are completely new to me, and I was like, what the fuck? It seems so crazy and contested and so on. And like the best way that I think I could kind of navigate it, or the way that I initially understood it anyway, to play out at Tate, was that there were kind of two differences. And like one was that curators in a museum like that are still primarily thinking about and working with objects and images, and educators are primarily thinking about people. And so with all of the kind of different duties of care that go along with those two different division. And then as someone put it to me, it might have been someone from the learning team at Tate, to kind of be really reductive, exhibitions curators are trying to create a singularity from a multiplicity, which we can, whether or not you think that's the case. And educators are trying to do the opposite. They're trying to create a kind of a multiplicity or a myriad from a singularity. They're trying to unpick or dismantle the exhibition. And it's not to say that I particularly agree with that view at all, but I do think there is, I sometimes feel like they're moving in different directions, like these two as practices, as kinds of visions.
Mm-hmm.
And when we all sit down, you know, with the team that we have at Nottingham, it's like, it sometimes feels like they're talking different languages.
Mm.
The jargon is very different. The planning time is very different. Like, so there's a kind of temporal divergence. In the exhibition, teams will be working 2 or 3 years out. Education teams 2 or 3 months or even weeks out. There's a spatial distinction that we've already talked about. You know, like, it's actually difficult to forge these kind of overlaps in ways that I would never have predicted before I started to work within a museum. It's like, what, this is crazy. Like, why is this so difficult?
But maybe, like, something that I'm at least thinking quite a lot about right now is, is this thing of that also becoming part of, like, you spent such a long time thinking something out, and you work with artists and on, you know, mining, like, a whole, you know, range of things that just takes you honestly just a long time. And then that point at which you can't ask the same of everybody around you, right? That you and you also can't just stay in your little kind of bubble, which is to say that at some point you have to be able to communicate or put things in language or talk or and then that becomes kind of, because what you're also, like, pointing to there is sort of a time investment, right?
Yeah, sure.
Like that you, from your own time investment to the time investment of the educators, of the educational team, and then to the time investment of, like, a visitor or anybody walking into the door, right?
Yeah.
So that's from, like, 3 years to 3 months to, you know,
3 minutes
anything
or
from
3 hours.
3 hours to 3 minutes.
Yeah,
sure.
You know, so it's also that kind of I mean, I want to call it reduction, but anyway, and how, you know, and how anything that you think about here will eventually go through that, like, that cycle.
That
I guess
compression.
whether you want to think about it or not, you can also not think about it, right? But eventually somebody will take over and think about it.
And within that span that you're describing, there's almost like it goes from very undirected. I mean, perhaps in a kind of, like, what I'm hearing you say of, like, it's quite an exploratory practice, right? Early on, of working with an artist or an exhibition, it could go in so many different directions. By the time that reaches a kind of educator, it's become more unidirectional, right? Or it's like, we're doing this, these are the set of questions. And this is often how it works, to the point. And then where that experience is then defined within the institution for the visitor participant, like, it feel like I'm imagining a kind of something that starts out very, very wide and takes a lot of time to something that becomes much more pointed.
Yeah, and we even feel within that kind of mode of operation, like, there's all these points where either you can, you know, you can somehow you can be stubborn and stick with what everybody else might not necessarily understand yet, because it's somewhat of a new proposition. Or at some point you can say, like, oh, fuck it, you know, I'll jump to, like, the easy one. The easy one being, you know, either a very institutional kind of language or frame of reference. You know, we all know the first solo show off in the first,
Sure.
you know, like,
oh god,
Yeah.
you know, where it's like you kind of, at least within an institutional setting, like you also have this kind of institutional frame.
Yeah,
Sure.
framework.
I first encountered this work at the Sharjah Biennale
Exactly.
As like an entry point. It's like, no, that's not. That's like
You can
validation from the start of your sentence.
exactly
Mm.
you can fall back on systems of validation,
Mhm.
Yeah.
which is, I guess, something that I'm just really kind of always observing when it
Mm.
comes to institutional, like say profiles and tensions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Like program. Where's sort of the what's the relationship there
Mm.
between those things? Like which institutions are actually like consciously putting a voice and a program and an intention forward that is conscious of the fact of not just falling back
Yeah.
to that and within that. And I think there's quite powerful kind of forces like drawing you to that sort of more mechanized way of operating, because it's also in the kind of in the global sense of things, that how that how as sort of a reach maybe is kind of increases, right? Or a reach is seemingly kind of infinite, right? That
Mhm.
there's a perception of the global art world.
Mm-hmm.
Then those kind of very kind of not strict, but those kind of parameters, they gain another force, right? Like if you're anywhere and you want to be part of it, there's sort of there's almost a language to speak.
Yeah, sure. And it's exactly that kind of fill in the blanks interpretation panel that you're describing of like the largest exhibition to date in XYZ. Dada explores XYZ. Yeah.
Yeah.
But these things are like, they're so, these different dynamics or ideologies are of course so embedded in the languages that museums continue to use, right? The very fact that what we're talking about is called interpretation, right, rather often, or the outreach is still, this kind of idea of the museum occupying the center and having to explicate its contents is still so often there, and even more forward-thinking museums, no?
Yeah.
Don't you think?
I think so, but there's also a bit of tension. I mean, some museums' websites now, when you Google under what they have in their collection, it links to a Wikipedia page.
Tate's does that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have this kind of almost co-editing of these texts, and I think that it's a grey area of contention in most museums when you're writing those wall texts, because in large scale institutions, which is most of my experience, there needs to be continuity between all texts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in my position at Tate Liverpool, there's certain things that I'm not allowed to say in public media. So writing things that you've just mentioned probably wouldn't be an okay thing for Tate to say, because that's not the sort of voice that Tate wants.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's obviously also questions about decolonializing museums now, where certain terms are being removed from text, but then not explained as to why they've been removed or what these terms might refer to.
The new MoMA is a version of this, right? That they've decided not to include the names of art movements in any of the text. So abstract expressionism becomes a kind, I think they call it action painting, but Dada gets removed. But suddenly, I mean, it kind of reinforces a kind of like actually an insistence on existing bodies of knowledge, because you kind of need to know also. If you don't know, you won't.
Okay, but that's really it's really annoying though, isn't it? It's like if I'm watching like a nature program with like David Attenborough, I want to know the names of the species and the plants, even though I'm not a biologist.
Yeah, sure.
And even the Earth's geographical periods.
Yeah,
I have no clue about geology, but I want to know the terminology. So I'm a little bit afraid that things are redacted in large-scale institutions, and that we'll lose something along the way. But maybe the public will revolt and say.
No, I think we need to hold on to the specificity of these terms still. I remember writing a text about, I think, Helio Oiticica when I was at Tate, and using like the term neoconcrete. and it kind of getting returned from the whatever the team is who does that stuff with like this kind of stricken and described. And it's like that was the name. We can define what that movement was and when it was and so on. But I think it's important still to.
Yeah. I mean, I try and see it now as more of a negotiation with that team rather than a I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah, sure.
And, you know, there's certain terms that I'm willing to negotiate, but I
Mhm.
think there's still a... But can I go back to your original question?
Mm.
Is that okay?
Mm.
I think
Wait, what was my original?
your original question was how we see educational models inside the gallery. I think something like that.
Well, yeah, in
Yeah.
your own, your
Yeah,
own
so
life, your own work.
I sit, because I'm a really good example talking about myself, I sit literally in between like the office of, on the left, learning team, education team, and on the right, the exhibitions team. And I just moved recently to this new place, like physically in the middle of both teams, because all my curatorial work has kind of been, you could call it related to pedagogical models, or it's related to the educational turn, and I just see it as integrated practice. But within Tate, I'm like a anomaly in that I don't sit in one team or the other, and then I kind of negotiate this language across both departments, and I see a great deal of expertise that's actually not always shared across both teams. So unlike your example, most of our learning team have MAs, some have PhDs, and everybody has an undergraduate degree in art history. But that knowledge is often not dismissed, but discouraged within the curatorial team based on their internationalism or their own ability to see contemporary art, which I think isn't always the case for the learning curators. I think they just have limited time or means, and they're not able to go and see as much as the other teams can. And I also think that there's also a way of producing exhibitions that can often exclude the voice of the educator, and that when it is presented to the educational team, it's like, there you go, this is my concept as a curator, and now you have to kind of program around this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's often a way of introducing that conversation much earlier on in the planning of the exhibition to allow for new voices, which is what you were mentioning earlier, that this doesn't have to be one particular person's vision of how this artist wants to articulate their work inside the museum.
And you work in effect at both a university and a museum. Is
Yeah.
that what the job is?
So in my university job, which is half my job, it's very formalized teaching. So I run a couple of courses, I have PhD supervision, and I also get research time. So that's quite luxurious, really, because it means I can run away to the university and do some research. Or but
Does the idea of education differ in the museum to the university in this kind of split job you have? Are you doing the same thing?
I think it's very much informed by my curatorial practice. All of the teaching I do involves some form of practical exploration of a concept or an idea, and I do that very European model of project-based teaching where I put the students to task on specific projects,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the sort of British model of constantly delivering classes that depend on you instilling knowledge on them.
Mm-hmm.
I like them to take on part of the ownership of the work. Yeah, I think
But
that's
you draw that distinction between a British model and a
Oh, yeah.
European model
Yeah,
in
because-
that sense.
because my first teaching job was in Switzerland, and there I was employed by an art school to teach, and I was given a few courses, but it was very vague, and some hours of teaching, and then you kind of do what you want. And it's in that model, it's based around project-based learning. So you have you know, let me think, what am I doing next semester? So I've booked a space in Tate for 5 days, which is called Tate Exchange, which is our kind of experimental learning platform. And I'll basically get the students to produce a curatorial project in that space. It might be a symposium, performance, a lecture series. They might, I don't know, commission artists. But I want them to kind of deliver that as part of their module outcomes,
Hmm.
rather than me giving them all the knowledge that they want.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it more interesting for me when I'm teaching as well, because
Mm-hmm.
it's not this constant delivery of ideas. And I have to say that I quite enjoy teaching, and I think I definitely, if I'm working on a project or if I'm thinking through an idea, I'll test it out on the students. They're amazing, and all these recent debates around equality, diversity, post-colonialism. I mean, I'm just lumping all that together as otherness, but all of the students are just totally equipped to talk about that than any of us are. I think that they're just aware of this, and I think it's really exciting to see what kind of creative workers they'll become in 5 years from now, because they're just immersed in this in these other areas. And of course it's coming from the content that they're being exposed to online, but they're also attending things and then being quite critical of museums as well.
Mm-hmm.
They're not positioning institutions as having all the answers. And I think obviously you could say historically, yes, artists have been critical of institutions, but it's really good to experience that and to be part of their dialogues as well.
What are their critiques?
A lot of it's about diversity, and that institutions are not inclusive enough, and I think we can all say that there's obviously a massive problem in the cultural industries, that there aren't enough career opportunities anyway. And then if you are coming from a diverse background, then your entry point is also challenged as well because of your education or your class or your gender or all these terms, and that's a key issue. And then of course, how is then that reflected in the program that happens in those institutions as well?
Mm-hmm.
So I've had students completely tear apart collection displays within museums because of all those kind of equality indexes. And when I was at university, I don't think we were that critical. I think we saw the museum and art history as being completely right and having all the answers, and that it was a path that we were just embedded in, but we weren't too critical. I mean, of course we had conversations about institutional critique, but it was you know,
it was more as a historical phenomenon, right?
yeah,
Or
it was like Andrea Fraser did this,
Yeah,
and then
sure.
that's the end of your art education in
yeah,
1998.
yeah, sure.
You know, so yeah.
Okay, I mean that feels very familiar to me as someone who didn't study art history. I think I was so eager to, in a kind of self-directed way. I was like very eagerly kind of imbibing histories of institutional, without just thinking like all of this needs to be completely overturned or dismantled or like expanded or like whatever, you know. But yeah, I noticed the same thing from students today, of just a very strong position of like, if I don't see myself represented in this institution, I'm not coming into your institution.
Exactly.
And that goes for like program, it goes for workforce, and it goes for visitors, you know. And I don't remember that happening. I mean, I might not have been hearing it, but I don't remember that happening when I was a student.
No, I think it's quite interesting. I've just been in the past weeks sort of been at the academy, the Royal Academy in Copenhagen, and talking to different of the students, their professors. The students invited me to sort of organize their degree show next year. So been in dialogue there, and it's kind of curious to me to kind of get the sense there that there's a student body who is in fact very critical of institutions, right? Like you have the sense that at least the context that I come from in the US, there's sort of those kind of prestigious programs, whether it's Columbia or Yale or Princeton or whatever, like that my sense there was like there's a whole other kind of path there created, right? What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to have like a smashing kind of degree work. Some galleries come from New York, picks you up, and there we go, right? Like Indian institutions follow, you're gonna, and it's a whole different scenario there. Like in it's also different, you know, scene. but there's like the level of kind of criticality towards institutions there is enormous to the degree that I feel even kind of my position, like I had to, be extra make an extra effort to really try and bridge that and say, hey, I'm not a bad guy, actually I'm kind of also here, just trying to push you forward and help you do more. But the sort of criticism there is extremely strong, which on the one hand I think is a sense that there's a big like art market out there, and that's something very removed from what it means to be finished as a student, and then also that there's a number of institutions whose work is really is very much oriented towards those systems of validation on a global scale, and have lost touch with all of those things that haven't reached those, haven't been part of those systems of validation yet, or it's just younger people coming out and they don't have anything to their name yet, and that at least in a more regional context, that institutions and institutional curators, they try to be part of the bigger discussion. Maybe they lose sight of the local and the smaller discussion in that effort.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that there has to be, even though you're based in a big institution that has a global reach, you still have to have a local outlook, actually, and kind of excluding that is not useful to your practice, because if you're also trying to produce projects and exhibitions that bring in audiences, you kind of need to know who they are and who are your publics that you're there to serve. And I think obviously that our stories of young people that we're working with obviously is challenging our own expectations, which is exactly what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
How do you both define your publics? I mean, what I mean in a very literal sense of do you think of them as visitors or publics or audiences? Do you have a preferred? I mean, they're all tricky terms for different reasons, right? But is there do you have a go-to? This is something I think about a lot. Do you have a go-to? Tate is audiences, right? Is that what Tate says?
I don't say that. I say comrades. No, I don't say that.
Fellow warriors.
Yeah, conspirators.
I kind of oscillate between community, constituents, publics. It depends. I don't know. I think I still haven't quite figured it out. But I use a couple of terms.
How about you, Helga?
Yeah.
I think I tend to say public, but it's also because I think a lot about voice. What voice do you have yourself, and what is it, and how do something that I do, an institution that I run do, that affects also a public opinion, which is sort of, I don't know how if the right word is public opinion, but yeah. But at least what I'm in, there's sort of the one mission is of course to speak to a public, and soon have a space, and there's a door, and you walk in through the door, and there's a real attempt to make people aware of that and bring them in, and I feel like another level of that is to have a public voice, have an identity in a public, in the mind of a public, and be present in a public sphere, which is to say, a public debate, a public forum, as an opinionated entity, which is to say, not indifferent, which I think goes beyond the success, or goes beyond the goal of sort of having as many people walk through the door as possible. I think a lot about that balance. I think institutions are under a lot of pressure to to show metrics, like audiences, number of audiences, that's such a kind of a powerful justifications, whether towards funders or
Sure.
kind of a political.
And the segmentation of those audiences
Yeah.
in terms of diversity.
Exactly, like that there's a lot of metrics to kind of what a public is, and then still I do feel that there's a balance to strike, being like not to lose sight of your public voice or your public mission or your public like identity in the sense of really daring to take a position as an institution and having a voice beyond the voice that says, oh, we just would love for you to come,
Yeah, sure.
Because I feel that there's on a larger scale in our society, there's a real need for that. It's something that artists can't do individually. Like, but who's the advocate? Like, who advocates for those practices and those ways of working? I feel that's kind of us. Like on a public level. Like,
Yeah, because we sort of champion those practices, don't we?
yeah, and I do feel that. I mean, I guess I am also asking myself that right now, like the kind of responsibility, like what is our responsibility? Like, one is to say, okay, there's this artist, there's this project, we're going to further it. The idea was there, she couldn't do it, now we're going to do it, right? That's taking somebody forward and then saying, hey, everybody, that's worth looking at. But then on another level, like what's the responsibility
What about
on behalf
yours?
of our field?
What about mine? Well, I think I tend to use public or publics, and for some of the reasons that Helga's outlined. I think the way that you articulated it hadn't somehow occurred to me before, but I think I agree with a lot of what you say. I think I don't say audiences, even though the way that we report to funders is often about precisely audiences, but I think that's just that in the UK we are an organisation like a theatre, like a whatever, that's in receipt of public funding, and so theatres talk about audiences, so museums and galleries have to as well, But then within the organisation, depending on what people are doing, they'll talk very differently. Like my head of marketing talks about customers. But that's he used to work at a independent cinema, and he'll often catch himself say, no, sorry, not customers, I mean visitors. And then our learning team would probably talk more in terms of communities. I think our exhibitions team would probably talk more in terms of constituents. Participants would probably be used elsewhere. So it's like, I'm very happy with that. I think for me, publics feels like a useful catch-all, and I think it kind of gets to exactly what you're saying, Helga, of like, what does it mean to be a public body today? Not to say like, there's a kind of, the tension in the UK is that we're increasingly not a publicly funded institution. Just at a point we're becoming pressured to somehow engage with this like mythical public or communities like more than ever before. Like that's a tension that's there for sure. But yeah, I think what I'm primarily interested in is exactly this kind of question of the public working with, alongside. Yeah, being a good, we were talking about it recently, just like being a good neighbour in the city, very simply put, I think in a way that's not like, this is our civic mission, it's just like, actually, what does it mean to be here, working kind of here at the moment? So kind of, yeah. I think the kind of question of like constituents, which obviously has kind of emerged in the last however many years, I'm interested in those kinds of conversations and about how they're being articulated by, museums like the Van Abbe Museum or now the Whitworth. But it feels to me like those have a more interesting dimension to it when they're being articulated by collecting institutions. I think, I'm not quite sure why that is, but I think there's something about the ways in which museums can think about their collections as a resource, as a public resource, in a way that obviously the Van Abbe has been exploring for many years. and the way in which they could think about decolonizing those collections or working with constituencies or constituents to kind of to do that. I think that offers a way of working that isn't open to us as a non-collecting institution in quite the same way. Sometimes when I look at some of the projects that are happening among that kind of group of museums, I think, well, that's, I can't quite see how we would echo or replicate that.
Why do you think it has to pertain to having a collection or not?
Because, this is the kind of permanent record of a museum, right? That this is like, if you're assuming that a collection is going to stay in situ and you're preserving this for posterity, I think this is kind of where you are making the future in a museum. For us, like, we don't have that, we have a different relationship to time, I think. We also just have much more limited space. So I was talking to Alistair Hudson, who's the director of the Whitworth in Manchester, and he's moving his office into the galleries to become more publicly accessible as the director for the museum. And he's turning his old office into a prayer room so that the museum can kind of perform other roles. And whatever you think about that as a move, when we were talking through it, I was like, I couldn't do that because we just have such limited exhibition space. I was like, and I want to keep I want to keep some, that actually to turn some space over as a canteen, as a whatever, I think when you're a larger scale museum, I think that becomes more interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think in my institution, there's certain, I think actually we do quite a lot of this sort of practice quite well, but we're very shy about it.
Mm-hmm.
And also the way we talk about working with constituents is, it's gone through various shapes and forms. So over the last 5 years, every year Tate Liverpool has commissioned a socially engaged art project in the top floor space, which is the most prestigious part of the institution, in the spring. And
what kinds of projects have they included?
so we had Opa Vivara, the Brazilian collective that do, they repurpose wheelchairs and add on to them all kinds of attachments, like a place to cook or to make a kind of print workshop with not just wheelchairs but other sort of wagons and things. And then in the gallery they created a large-scale hammock. They had a tattoo transfer studio, and they had a tea area where you could like contemplate and reflect. So kind of that's an example of installations inside the gallery. And then there's a project that I co-curated, which was it's an ongoing work by an artist called Christopher Klein. It's called OK the Musical, and it's a musical that now he's performed in I think 5 institutions, including one in Denmark. And so we took an iteration of that. Now you can articulate that in 2 ways. One is as an installation in the gallery, and then people understand it as visual art and it's an immersive world, it's an installation, or you can understand it through its process-driven, participatory nature, where as a visitor to the museum, which is usually about static, dry goods, as in artworks, you see people in the gallery rehearsing, building a stage, building props, rehearsing their songs, and so the outputs were a couple of musical performances, but actually I found the process much more interesting and more connected to what the institution's been doing for a longer period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, we struggle with that a lot because we're not designed to have people in the galleries for a long period of time. Things like hot water, toilets, warm rooms, human comforts. Just it's a gallery. It's not designed for people to spend days in. It's cold. It has bad lighting. It's all these kind of problems. So when we were doing that project, it was kind of like, well, what are we turning the gallery into, and why don't we just use a theatre, or why don't we use a community space? And it's kind of a question of architecture again and space. But my point was that there's a sort of legacy of that in the institution, and there's even, I think it even goes beyond that into the 90s. And then there have also been various collection-based iterations. So there's one right now where an education curator, learning curator, and exhibitions curator co-curated with 3 primary schools, I think it was 3, a display. And the children and their teachers selected artworks, and then the works are on rotation. Every couple of months, works get swapped around, and it's seen as a teaching resource in the gallery for those local primary school children. But there's also that point of agency, and that we are saying as Tate Liverpool, we've co-produced this with this audience. But we're not good at talking about that. I think we have a problem with articulating that we're open to those dialogues, and that it's like what you said earlier, it's about choosing the right artist and having the right kind of practice, but we kind of don't perhaps commemorate it as we would it with other first exhibitions of prominent artists. And that might be because of the constituent led nature of it, that somehow it's slightly less. Of course I'm contradicting myself because I don't believe in that, but that is an inherent problem. And I think that's also one of the dangers of that as well, is that you have an expectation then, because you have an audience, a public that expects an invitation to collaborate with in some capacity. And there's currently a work now that's being produced with Mikhail Karikas, and that'll happen in the spring. And so this is ongoing, but I don't think the entire institution and the institutional memory is conscious of it, that this is happening inside our art museum. And I think also museums aren't equipped for long-term projects.
It's true. Yeah. I've always been very aware that quite often when museums tend to set up schools or academies or whatever, they're temporary. You know, like there was when the new museum hosted night school. Yeah, it was however long it was, like a year or something. Or around that same time, the Hayward did an exhibition called Wide Open School Academy. I can't remember what it was.
Wide Open Academy, I think.
Yeah, so they often end up either occupying a kind of exhibition slot, or they end up taking over the kind of for an academic year. But then my kind of impression of these might be wrong, is that they then tend to leave very little trace. Often because they are organised by education departments, and as we've discussed, there is that kind of divide. Possibly it's a question of documentation. Possibly it's a question of funding. I don't know what it is, but I would be interested to see how museums are learning from either those students who you're talking about and their critiques, or the kind of programs like this to kind of actually to shift, to adapt.
I also feel that it's part of like this kind of the identity, or at least the story that institutions tell themselves and tell their publics. Whether you have a collecting institution, there's a narrative there. You might bring in artists to interpret the collection, right? But when you have those kind of odd outs, like they sort of don't fit as smoothly within like a larger trajectory or larger history, or kind of a more fundamental identity, right? At least when you have a collection and you have collection galleries and etc. Whether there's an institution like yours, like you much to a much larger degree, like you built your identity around a connection between those projects, from artist to artist, from work to work. Meaning that there's sort of like also there's a kind of a writing of story there, where I feel sometimes institutions, it's difficult for them to write those things into their core story. And then they kind of tend to slip out of it when 2 years down the line the story is being told, like they're not, and it's funny because it also comes down to these kind of inconveniences, like the number of like performative work I initiated in a new museum. It's like every time it was like, but where does the performers like change clothes? It's like there's no, there's nowhere that they are just an inconvenience for how the institution
Mm.
operates.
Yeah, sure.
Thereby not said that there's an unwillingness to accommodate them. There's sort of just a problem
Mm.
in the sense that it's not made for it. But I really feel that there's something to say about the kind of also the narrative that you write as an institution, you know,
Mhm.
as a director of an institution, like what, where those things fall on the line. Are they center stage,
Yeah, sure.
or are they actually kind of out here in the periphery?
It feels to me like it's what's permissible is when these changes of direction are framed as essentially performative.
Mm.
So it's permissible for the Hayward Gallery to transform itself into an academy for 2 months. It would be inconceivable for it to say, we're going to be an art school for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Just like I saw a project, so maybe like a Rob Pruitt project in Zurich like last year, where he turned the Kunsthalle into a church, like a functioning church. So the duration of the, fine. Might have been more like what happens if it just decides to be a church for 5 years? I mean, they're not going to do that for a whole bunch of really obvious reasons, but like these things are permitted so long as it's understood to be a gesture or a temporary gesture. I'm saying something like super obvious in a way, but
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you've got like peripatetic projects like Ahmadiyya Silent University,
Mhm.
which is dependent on the hospitality of multiple institutions to sort of
Mhm.
host that as it sees fit.
Mhm.
But that longitudinal project, I think museums can't do that. I think
Mhm.
museums just cannot do long-term projects.
Mhm.
I think we just it's which is a real shame actually. I think obviously
But collection, I suppose that's when I come back to collection
It's that-
building.
it's that
Collection building
collection.
is a long-term project. That's what that's
yeah.
the core of what museums do. Still, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on how they view their identity, though. I mean, this I suppose Van Abbe Museum almost to me seems like a Kunsthalle with a collection, because I suppose it's quite small scale, so it can make rapid changes than perhaps a large scale institution. I don't know. But I also think there's also that point of museums having different identities and also different audiences. I mean, your examples from the new museum earlier on, where you trace these trajectories or this curatorial profile that the education team had with the work that they produced, that sort of stayed in the institutional memory, and we're aware of these projects occurring at that time that have left their mark on the teams.
I guess it's also. I also feel it comes back to like space, like very much like those kind of experimental kind of modes of, then you have 2 months and then you turn the whole thing into and then you go back again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that in a way it becomes part of a narrative of saying today artists, really, question the exhibition space, meaning we question it and go back. Exhibition space,
I think that's it. I think it's completely, for me, it's very much imbricated with the ideology of the white cube, and the way in which that pertains beyond the parameters of the exhibition spaces per se, meaning, exactly just to echo what you're saying, like that everything kind of goes back to zero, or back to the kind of fiction of the neutral zero. And so, yeah, with education programs, you start over. Just like with exhibitions, like it's occasionally we almost have to remember that from one show to the next in like changeover, we can kind of keep elements, that you don't have to strip everything back and paint it white. And that kind of, that fiction of neutrality or kind of a baseline, I think institutions behave like that in a whole range of different ways. That kind of, we have a seasonal cycle like a lot of museums do, and it's kind of like that's the learning team and so on. They don't have to do that, but they also think in that kind of way. That, this kind of, it is somehow, they are resistant to long-term projects, as you say. Would it be desirable if they weren't? I mean, what would be gained by being able to embark on?
Well, I was just thinking of, as an example, the really, small-scale institution of Praxis in Berlin that was there for a number of years. they worked with a number of artists over the period of, was it 1 year or 2 years?
6 months, I think.
6 months, yeah, and they had like a change of exhibition. It wasn't long term; it was medium term. But you'd never. It's very rare that you'd get the opportunity to work with an artist over a 6-month period and for them to change their exhibition. But
a model I think of is, I mean, what Anthony Huberman did at the Artists Institute in New York and now at CCA Wattis in San Francisco. Of like, as I understood it, I only went a couple of times in New York, but they would show essentially one artwork in this shopfront basement space for 6 months. You'd have like a Rosemary Trockle work there, and the programming just became around that and spending time with it and talking with it. And they don't quite do that at the Wattis now, but something that I've just noticed and feel quite drawn to is they just have this thing on their website where they say such and such is on our mind. So I think like right now it's like Joan Jonas is like on our mind. And it might kind of feel a bit kitschy, but I kind of, this like, I suppose this is like longer, you wouldn't go as far as calling this a commitment, but it starts to, I thinking back to what you were saying, Helga, about like the voice of like, well, how do we break out of just the kind of prescribed like narrativizing of the institution in that kind of, like, I think these kinds of things where you're talking in terms of affinities and like personal, you know.
But if we have long-term collections and we have long-term loans that we have on show, which might be on for years, or in, you know, civic museums across the UK have paintings that have been on show for 50 years or longer. Like,
well, the National Gallery is 90% of its collection is on display.
But then there's that the collections are longitudinal, as you said before, but then all developments of program are not. But
I guess I'm also to answer your question from before. I guess I also wonder, like, if, you know, if you were to embark on a kind of institutional program, or even kind of a way of thinking about yourself as an institution, and having a goal of like shifting over time, right? I guess what would the consequence be of doing such kinds of shows, and then really taking the consequence and saying, you know, like that over a period of time you even shift how you operate, or how you function, how you divide space. So I mean that seems also like a very fragile thing to do.
Yeah, sure.
Because then you sort of you put your own kind of authority in question.
Absolutely.
Kind of along the way, and that authority you actually need to stand firm.
Yeah, sure.
In order to even survive, or to I guess to also kind of expand and be able to do what you do, right?
Yeah, sure.
But there's sort of a counterforce.
Yeah.
Counterforce there, where the 1 month kind of temporary school, it serves your argument very well. You know, well-meaning when you jump back and continue.
It performs flexibility, or it gives the guise of something else while actually just staying utterly the same.
I guess that would be one way of of thinking.
But I mean, you know,
it.
but isn't this is also this is a definition of institutions, like as Mary Douglas's definition of institutions is like, institution is something that does the same thing over and over again. That's everything else is window dressing, right? I mean, I think about this thinking about my own institution. It's like, I think a lot of what we do is pretty good, you know, but when I look around at like other places, they're doing more or less the same thing. It's kind of just like more or less like the kind of the container is the same. The content might be a little bit different, but actually the kind of the rhythms, most things are, you know, widespread. I don't see that many places behaving totally differently. I might not be looking far enough.
But and I guess that's also something that I ask myself, like what pressures are institutions under? You know, sometimes you can sit and you wanna act within the kind of the freedom of your field and like the freedom of inquiry and all of these things. But I guess I also, you know, wonder, like, institutions also accommodating a great many things. and far from all of those things are audiences.
Mhm.
If institutions were only accommodating audiences, there might be like a difference. That might be a different side of the story. But I do think that there's like on a kind of a larger kind of societal scale,
Mhm.
that there's sort of there's pressures there, or maybe not necessarily also in the negative sense, but there's a role to fill.
Mhm.
I wonder,
Mhm.
what about biennials then, or perennial exhibitions? Because I sort of see them as temporary institutions. Obviously not in all cases, but whenever you see a new announcement of a new Biennale or triennial or whatever, you're sort of given this new mission statements that's articulating that biennial's specific vision, that's making it avant-garde against all the other biennales in the world. And obviously it's because you have a temporary assemblage of curators, theorists, artists that come together, and then I don't know, it's reinventing the wheel, but it's articulated in a specific way.
Mhm. I think there's been shifts. I'd say that if you look back in the early 2000s, there's really kind of, in some quarters, this like deeply felt belief that biennials are the places that can do exhibitions in large-scale ways, experimental ways, that museums simply can't. Like Francesco Benami, like writing about his Venice Biennale in like 2003, literally says that. It's like, this is the kind of format of the future. And then I think by the end of that decade, the way I see it is suddenly, weirdly, biennials start to want to adopt the modes of the museum again. I remember seeing the Istanbul Biennial that Adriana Pedrosa and Jens Hoffmann did. It was specifically laid out like a museum. It was like they built museum spaces in warehouses. And so suddenly that kind of earlier 2000s idea of like wanting to, infiltrate the fabric of the urban, etc., was like, actually, we're going back to White Cube. And I think to a degree, like the 2013 Venice Biennale did that. I mean, in a very different way, but it was trying to think about itself as a kind of neo-ethnographic museum, perhaps. And I don't really know what's going on now. I mean, I don't know if there is a kind of particular, it feels like it's just so atomized. But I guess that idea of temporary institutions, it's there, right? I mean, with Documenta, if you go back to like, say, Catherine David's, this idea of like 100 guests, or this kinds of like a congregation, a constellation, that's kind of there in so many biennials, right, of the last 20,
Absolutely.
25 years.
Yeah, but in order for them to be sustainable, they have to articulate what they're doing in a innovative way, or has to be at least be perceived in that manner. If we think of the previous Documenta had what was it called? The Parliament of Bodies.
That was the public program.
It's a public program, yeah, which was perceived as a kind of thinking machine that would then inform the rest of the exhibition. But again, how are those conversations or those things documented or actually drawn into the White Cube?
Sure. And I guess Documenta feels like the special case in a way, right? Because it's 5 years and the budget is so off the scale compared to others. Venice is another bit of a special case, I would say, just because of the particularity of where it is and its long history, and also that it kind of gone.
I would say maybe also the financial structures around it, right?
Right.
That might be the opposite end of Documenta.
Meaning?
No, I guess thinking about also like maybe specifically the last two, this one and the past. I guess I've just been noticing a lot of I guess critique and analysis of the shows is how many of those artists are actually like very ingrained within a market structure, right?
Sure.
And for sure that there's also a dependence on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And which, without knowing the specific documents, I would assume that there is sort of a different relationship
I
there,
think so. Yeah.
or maybe just to kind of put that on the table as something that does, that does matter.
For sure, yeah. I think with the last documenter, the team were pretty explicit. Like, we're not showing gallery artists here.
Yeah.
I mean, they kind of did, but
Yeah.
not many. Versus, I remember coming to Biennales here in the past, and they're just being dealers, like standing by their artist's work, like it's an art fair, And so, yeah, I guess but that's a kind of obvious kind of economic kind of distinction between them. But back to your kind of question, Michael, how do you see biennials as engaging with education?
Well, there's been a recent trend in the last 5 years where biennials have returned to a model of mediation, actually. So Liverpool Biennial, Sao Paulo Biennial, and I think the last Bergen Assembly all had teams of mediators, the last Documenta, they called it a chorus of mediators, which is an interesting shift. So it's gone from this model of sort of delegated knowledge production through conversations, workshops, external influences, to having like a team of on-site mediators that will not only develop public program but will lead tours and guide the public through that experience. I think that's quite interesting that sort of came back again, and I think
in the sense that this is actually just pretty close to the kind of older idea of museum docents.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It is that model that's being used again, and I experienced it when I visited those examples I mentioned. That you could go on a tour by one of those mediating team members. And then you could attend part of their own programming. It didn't, but then as a visitor, I guess I'm not really the best person to judge because I usually know what I'm looking at. But I think that
maybe Helge. I mean, you have worked. Neither of us have worked on a biennial before, and you have. Like, what?
Yeah.
How did education enter into it in the role that you were doing?
Yeah, in terms of making the exhibition, very little. Like, again, I mean, I think that did function very much like what we were talking about earlier in an institutional setting where that sort of comes in at the end, right? And you provide a point of entry for all those mediators, and then that becomes what they build on. It's specifically like textual, actually.
Yeah, sure.
You produce the texts,
and
that's the text, and the educational team they take that as a starting point and expand on that, and I think that was very much the case. Yeah, the case here.
But I think obviously beyond Venice, there are ones in Liverpool, Istanbul, etc., even Berlin. There's a kind of expectation on the venues as well to produce their own education program, that wherever that's been, hosted by for the duration of the Biennale, that they also have to ensure that their publics are comfortable in that dialogue of the guest curated exhibition that's sort of in transit. And I know that the upcoming Berlin Biennial is trying to do a long-term program of engagement, quote unquote, by occupying a space in Wedding in Berlin and having a series of iterations of their program alongside a hefty public program of talks and debates, which is also interesting. So it's not just about the finished product,
the thing,
which I actually quite like.
Yeah,
because it's long term.
I think there's also, like, in terms of thinking about mediation of biennials, I think there's quite a large task there where sort of the international or the global is translated into the local. Like, I feel like internationally operating moving curators who kind of roam around and sort of speak a language of discourse that's, those exhibitions, they're often made in as a position or as a in a very specific landscape and relates to other of those large scale shows. elsewhere around the globe, obviously a local audience
Yeah,
has
sure.
no clue. They haven't just
Yeah.
seen the last 3, whatever,
Yeah.
large scale exhibitions that X exhibitions built on. So I
Yeah.
feel that how I've experienced this, that there's actually like, the main task is really somehow to translate something that is at its core just like, an international language and discourse into something that's locally relevant,
Hmm.
or that's even not locally understood.
Sure. And
Um,
often it will be that first week or even few days before the local audiences or any kind of public is even, there's just like the professional audience is there for 3 days. Like someone said, like the vernissage is the finissage, at Venice, it's like, it's that first few days. And then you're right, there's this like shift to then, as we've seen here today, like the Arsenal is absolutely packed. And I would guess that for a lot of people coming outside of those opening weeks, they're not typically going to see contemporary art.
Really?
Hmm. That would be my guess. I'm basing that on just like having come here 2 weeks after the opening and just in terms of the kinds of received behaviors through to like any other kind of number of kind of things. It just felt like it's a Venice tourists, and this is a kind of cultural like spectator sport like any number of other things in Venice.
Yeah, but I guess it's also, I guess it's like when we talk about whether we call them audiences or publics, right? Like once you start to like subdivide that and then say, who are all those people who just go to New York and they go to the Statue of Liberty and then they go to MoMA?
Yeah, sure.
And whatever is on at MoMA, who the hell knows?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
I guess there's, that's what you're talking about,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a term in the UK that's used, like an unexpected guest or something like that. Really, that they kind of that they're just coming in to have a look. But I suppose that's in major museums and collections, especially the UK, where they're free. That must be a massive amount of visitors that have no clue or little interest in art, or maybe vast interest in art, and then enter this institution which then has to speak this international language because you're not assuming their identity or where they're coming from.
Yeah. No, I guess I think it's quite a somewhat important question also, because I also feel that like that you can't sit on the institutional end or even, let's say, the curatorial end and then not have that level of like awareness and generosity towards all of those people, right? Because ultimately, like when you're here and you are in the Arsenale and like you can't even see a work just because there's a forest of people, right? And you are professionally annoyed, right? But then, then is the next step not that you should be, in a way, professionally sort of impressed or at least or grateful or curious on behalf of the amount of people who are actually interested, right? Or who actually like get up in the morning and move their body to that venue for whatever reason, right? I guess I wonder, like there's also something there to say that it's also not entirely, it's also not entirely, or it is not, negative that you go into these things. But I feel like it's quite sort of a problem by now. Like you go to major institutions around the world, and like it's a serious crowd issue.
Yeah, sure.
That there's like those crowds. It's
That's that's what the MoMA redesign was trying to deal with, right? It's like flow and congestion and these kinds of terms that we're more used to applying to department stores or airports, like transitional spaces.
Customers.
Yeah, customers, back to customers.
Yeah, that's so much to think about. Also, just because I still gravitate. I was in London last week and I went to the Tate and it was like, oh my god.
On a weekend.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was, a few weekends ago in Paris, the Pompidou. What a, what a kind of hellish experience.
Yeah, I know. I just had a good friend in Berlin telling me that he'd gone to Tate Modern. And he was like, "What a terrible place! Escalators, thousands of people everywhere in the way of all the art. It was awful." And I was like, "No, it's great. It's like accessible. People come in.
Mm-hmm.
It's millions of visitors, and there's a different attitude as well in it, and how you look at it." And in response to your point about being people arriving in Venice and then, or people visiting a place and going straight to a museum, just to see whatever's on. I think mine is that I always visit botanical gardens wherever I am, if there is one in that place, because they're just incredible.
I've started to do that too, and aquariums as well.
Oh, I haven't done that.
Yeah.
Go to the one in Copenhagen. Oh my god.
Oh yeah, it's good. Well, the best aquarium I've been to is the one in Monterey in California.
Oh,
It's just south of San Francisco,
I've
and
been
it's
there.
and it's actually done a little like a museum. Like, I don't know how they can do this in terms of, but they're like, the hang is essentially like the fish are laid out according to like color and form. It's like an old-fashioned museum. It's nothing to do with like species or geography, and so you just got all of like the blue ones or the triangular ones. It's really extraordinary.
But I feel that there's sort of a question. I mean, as much as you look at those things, and you also feel like a sense of kind of, like, ultimately, like, I feel it's important to have a humbleness towards that, right? Not to say, oh my God, those crowds, get away from me, but to feel like, hey, there's a lot of people that just show up. Like, just the fact that they show up is incredible. And then, you know, then to that end, we get into kind of crowd control, you know, museum expansions. How do you deal with crowds? Museums obviously growing bigger and bigger because there's more and more. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I feel like there are those small non-collecting institutions, like such as yours or the one I'm now building. And I feel that there it's a whole, you know, we don't, or at least I don't know if you do, like, deal with those problems. There's sort of a kind of field there in which there's also an argument to be made for what practices do those institutions then house and hold. I do feel that there's sort of a remove or certain things function very well within those kind of mega structures, right? There's also a demand on what can attract those kinds of of crowds, or not necessarily attract if you don't know what you're coming for, but what can make that a successful experience in the eyes of somebody who come without intention, just just based on an institutional identity.
Yes.
Versus over here, like, where, like, what you do is very content and let's say discourse driven, right?
Yeah, I mean, depending on where these institutions, like which cities they occupy, right? And like beyond New York, LA, London, Paris, and probably a handful of others, yeah, like almost like by definition, if you're outside of those, you're doing something kind of different. I don't know if this relates, but I was in Los Angeles a year or so ago, and just on, you have the Broad Museum there as of like 3 years ago, which is free, opposite MoCA on Grand, and there's a line around the block for the Broad Museum, and the collection there is terrible, and MoCA is completely empty. And I have no kind of broader point there other than, like, these are museums built at entirely different moments. You know, like one designed and built in the mid-'80s and one designed and built like 5-8 years ago. And the ways in which they were just like engaging with, social media kind of most broadly. But it's like, it was really fascinating. And kind of a friend of mine went to LA and came back and he was like, the Broad's incredible. And I'd sent him a list of things to do, and he said, I don't know why you told me to go to MoCA. That place is miserable. And, like, the collection's so boring. I was like, oh my God, it's like, I'm not saying anything at all interesting, apart from sounding like a grumpy old guy. But
it's kind of back to your window dressing point you made earlier. Is it like the window dressing versus?
Is it the window? Yeah, I mean, that feels like a kind of the Broad building, which is a Cordilla Scofidio Renfro building feels like it's almost like a hyperactive. It's trying to suck in attention. You know, like it's got a kind of shtick that it's like it's not theme parkish. It's not like as far down the line as that, but there is a kind of theatricality to what that building does. And you start in this kind of caverns below, and you get spat out in kind of top lit galleries at the top, and it's like it's an experience that you get on an escalator, and that escalator is not just about kind of moving people, it's a part of the kind of the passage through.
But I think it's
building.
because people like experiences. I mean, that is a fact. I mean, I took my students to a show on Tuesday in a White Cube, a really lovely photography exhibition, and then I said on the way back I wanted to look at. In Liverpool there's a maritime museum which is all about Liverpool's maritime heritage, but it has this like incredible exhibition about the Titanic, which I take everyone to that visits, because there are various objects from the wreckage and about its history, but the whole narrative of that display exhibition is that it takes you on a journey. It uses music to guide you emotionally through, and it's phenomenal. And we were talking about exhibition display, and then it was important that we kind of posited the White Cube with something immersive like that. And I think historical museums and museums that aren't always art-based, like aquariums even, just do it in an interesting manner.
I would guess, though, that their education spaces look almost exactly the same.
Yes.
Because there's like a look, right, to these kinds of spaces of education in museums. Like the furniture is often the same, No?
Plastic floor covering.
Yeah.
Certain smell.
This might be a UK thing.
But I guess it's also, when you bring up the Broad, I feel that there's also this question of to what extent, I mean, even in a museum like that, right? To what extent is it desirable, or to what extent do you bother your audiences with scholarship?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And really in that way,
Yeah, sure.
bother them with scholarship.
Absolutely.
Because
Yeah.
it's and there you go back to sort of, that's a direct question to say, what's the educational mission of the
Yeah,
museum?
Yeah.
Like at its core.
Sure.
Right, and I guess that might be an example of an institution who sort of, I mean, it's a new institution, so it's not like they have a lineage of, and then they started, and then they decided to deviate, right? It's, but I guess it's in this kind of founding of new institutions.
Yeah.
With what educational missions
Yeah.
are they founded, and historically, of course, that's very strong, and there's sort of a letting go of that.
I mean, yeah, I like that phrase, not bothering them with scholarship. It's like, yeah, that feels really what's going on there. I mean, what was very noticeable at the Broad was that the logic of display is closest to an art fair. Like, it's a series of booths that are more or less the same dimensions as art fair booths. The works all seem to have been bought at art fairs in the last decade. And so you get a shift from the kind of early years of, MoMA type institutions from the 30s, 40s, 50s, which are kind of, in terms of display techniques, borrowing from department stores, would have been arcades before that and all the rest. It's like now, I mean, I can't think of other examples, but with the Broad actually aping the logic of the place of like sales of the work that you are seeing. There's a seamlessness of transit between the kind of the space of commerce and the space of display, and what the space of education is, that I don't know. Cynically, one might wonder that is the reason that people seem to love this place, love the Broad, is because education has been evacuated from its mission.
I went to the new Bauhaus Museum in September in Dessau, and was just horrified by this experience. So it's just this beautiful glass shiny new museum in the middle of the town, but you have to buy a ticket with an entry time like you're visiting a major exhibition, but it's just a lot of the Bauhaus collection on show, and so I queued up like I was going into a theme park, was let into the galleries, and then literally when I was in there for exactly 59 minutes, we were told on the tannoy that we all had to leave, and literally everybody was like thrown out. We came out the other side, and then the next lot came in, so everyone just had literally 1 hour slot to experience an entire history of the Bauhaus in a really bad selection of exhibition displays. It was just unbelievable.
But that's a crowd control.
Yeah,
Question.
it's a crowd control gesture taken to an extreme, where you're told on a tannoy that you must leave the gallery, and it felt very forced, like in and out, and kind of not really. There's just no time to ponder, and aside from a few other issues with like terrible interpretation, inaccessible vitrines, it was awful.
Somehow makes me think back to the conversation we were having around the earlier years of the National Gallery,
Yeah.
and people having picnics in
Yeah.
there. And I think what feels so unlikely or kind of like comical about that from our perspective today is not only that you're having like food alongside Rembrandt's or whatever, it's that you can actually bring your own food to the gallery
Yeah.
and then spend a really long time there.
Yeah.
No, which is like just the kind of a counter model to what you're describing of like an experience economy timed kind of thing where Yeah.
And it's also the article that we read about museum seating, where the kind of level of comfort in the museum and how that's evolved through time. And how if you go and watch a video installation and you have to lie on the floor for an hour in severe discomfort just to watch a film. all
yeah.
these kind of
Well, and the kinds of bodies that are supported in these institutions
Yes.
now or assumed. Yeah.
Well, I went to performance a few weeks ago during Freeze Week, and had to sit on the floor for 2 hours cross-legged, and I could barely get up when the performance ended because my legs were just numb. But I'm able-bodied, so I'm able to experience that, but that's not for everybody. And it's almost like performance now in museum is for young people as well. It's kind of a Instagram-ready piece that one experiences, and then you can capture it on your device or endure it.
We've somehow been talking for almost 2.5 hours.
Yep.
Do you have any final remarks?
Oui. Your last words. No, but I feel like where we just like ended up in the sense of, what is how question mark do institutions like hold on to their educational mission as they grow and expand and think more intensely about experience and visitors experience and crowd control and flow and all of these things, where do scholarships sit within that? Where do an educational mission sit within that? Because I guess that's sort of the spectrum between asking somebody like what do you want, and then telling them this is what I think you should get. I guess if you go over and say like it's simply about asking what do you want and then providing that, I guess sort of then you let go of the let's say the more knowledge driven aspect of institutional work. Let go of maybe a big word, but I think there's sort of a spectrum there, right? And the possibilities to slide adrift within it. Which is not to say that that crowds only want contentless content shows.
I think you're right. I think there is that sliding approach that different audiences demand different activities, experiences, encounters inside art spaces, and I think some want a more actively engaged process through a formal education program. Others just want to receive it as a passive visitor. I think it's fine. I think it doesn't have to be prescribed in the way it was in the past. But what I am concerned about is that it becomes invisible, and I think that that's a key issue.
Mm-hmm.
I guess also the question, like as an institution, is your job to give people what they want?
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, or what they need, or what they
Yeah.
don't yet know that they want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, or the thing that they don't know that they want.
I think not knowing is probably as good a point as any to finish this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.